Welcome to Asian American Life. I'm your host, Ernabelle DeMillo. For the last 13 years, we have told the stories of Asian America. We have also featured our community's history in the U.S., a history often missing at schools. To celebrate Asian American Pacific Heritage Month, we want to take you, our viewers, on a journey. We'll take a look at our roots and routes, our immigration story. Did you know that the first Asians landed in what would become the continental U.S. 33 years before the Pilgrims landed? Filipino sailors set foot on Morro Bay, now California, on October 18, 1587. They were part of a Spanish galleon traveling between Mexico and the Philippines. And it's the reason why today we celebrate Filipino American History Month in October. Filipinos were also the first Asians to settle in America before the United States became a country. According to historians, in the 1760s, an estimated 150 Filipino sailors on a Spanish galleon jumped ship and settled in St. Malo in Louisiana. They became known as the Manila Men.
And they found a place in St. Bernard, Louisiana, where other people spoke Spanish, where they can fish and make a living, and everyone left them alone.
The Filipinos lived in the thriving fishing village until 1915, when a hurricane destroyed St. Malo. Recently, in 2019, a marker was unveiled in a historic ceremony honoring the Manila Men and St. Malo as the earliest Asian American permanent settlement in the U.S. Next, we'll take you on a journey through time, starting with the 19th century. Here's a look at Asian Americans who transformed our history.
Birthright citizenship is guaranteed by the 14th Amendment and cemented in 1898 by a landmark Supreme Court decision called Wong Kim Ark versus the United States. That historic case guaranteed citizenship for children of all immigrants born in the U.S. Now that constitutional right is being challenged by a Trump executive order. The Supreme Court will be hearing arguments to end birthright citizenship in a few weeks. Their ruling could define what it means to be American and whether or not we still live in a democracy or authoritarian government. Legal scholars are optimistic that the legacy of Wong Kim Ark will prevail.
We take you back to the late 1800s, at the heels of the Civil War. Immigrants from all over the world were coming to America when Wong Kim Ark was born in San Francisco in 1873. And though he was the son of Chinese immigrants, the 14th Amendment guaranteed he was a natural-born citizen. Wong Kim Ark grew up amidst anti-Chinese sentiment. When he was about 10 years old, the United States passed the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882.
The Chinese Exclusion Act was one of the first immigration laws, and it was absolutely racially motivated, fueled by this broad xenophobia felt in the United States at this time, where large groups of Chinese immigrants had come to the United States to help build the railroads and produce sort of this economic boom that was starting to happen in the United States with urbanization and industrialization.
Eventually, Wong Kim Ark's parents moved back to China.
At one point, he decides to go back to China to visit his parents. He's maybe 17 years old. A young man travels back to China and returns to the United States actually without incident.
A few years later, Wong Kim Ark paid his parents another visit. Before leaving the U.S., the 21-year-old had documents notarized to certify he was a U.S. citizen. But upon his return to the States, he was denied entry.
The official that was reviewing his documentation upon entry into the United States determined that he was not a U.S. citizen, that he was a citizen of China, and that he would be excluded pursuant to the Chinese Exclusion Act.
With support from the Chinese American community, Wong Kim Ark brought his case all the way to the Supreme Court. On March 28, 1898, in a 6-2 decision, the Supreme Court ruled in favor of Wong Kim Ark, reaffirming that any child born on U.S. soil is automatically a U.S. citizen.
And the Supreme Court was very clear about this at this moment in history where, as I mentioned before, like xenophobia, anti-Chinese sentiment was at a historic peak. And at that moment, they recognized that there was no question that the Constitution protected the right to U.S. citizenship for Wong Kim Ark.
David Baluarte is an associate dean at CUNY School of Law. He says overturning the 14th Amendment is a tall order.
The only way that that rule is going to change is with a constitutional amendment.
A constitutional amendment requires 2/3 majority of the House of Representatives and the Senate, and 3/4 of the states need to ratify that decision by a supermajority of that state's Congress.
And in our polarized political environment right now, and there's no way that that is going to result in the kind of political support that would be required to actually amend this aspect of the Constitution. Absolutely not.
Baluarte and other legal experts have faith in the U.S. Constitution and the legacy of the Supreme Court's landmark decision in Wong Kim Ark versus the United States.
Please don't worry. Please don't worry. Birthright citizenship is not going to be taken away, not in the next 4 years. It's hard for me to imagine. You're putting money on that. And I absolutely will.
Today, Wong Kim Ark's descendants are speaking out in support of the right their great-grandfather had fought for throughout his life. In 1848, gold was discovered at Sutter's Mill, and within months, thousands flooded into California from across the U.S. and around the world, including thousands of Chinese immigrants lured by tales of Gamsan, or Gold Mountain. What began as opportunity quickly turned into hardship. Chinese miners faced fierce discrimination, pushed out of the best mining areas, and made to pay a special foreign miners' tax. Violence against Chinese communities spread with impunity, from mob attacks to forced expulsions. When the Central Pacific Railroad needed a cheap labor force to build the western leg of the Transcontinental Railroad, they turned to Chinese laborers who made up 80% of their workforce and were tasked with the most dangerous jobs. They blasted through the Sierra Nevada, laid track across brutal terrain, and endured deadly conditions with little recognition. In 1869, the Transcontinental Railroad was completed, but the Chinese laborers who built the railroads were excluded from this commemorative photo in Promontory Rock, Utah. More than 150 years later, photojournalist and activist Corky Lee corrected this erasure with what he called photographic justice by recreating this picture with the descendants of the Chinese laborers who built the Transcontinental Railroad. Many became victims of the Chinese Exclusion Act and were subjected to social prejudice and violence. But another immigration law helped to make Chinese exclusion possible. For Asian American Life, I'm Rainer Ramirez.
I'm Vivian Lee. The first federal law that restricted immigrants to this country based on race targeted Asian women. If you're not familiar with the law that was enacted 150 years ago and how it profoundly influenced American life, you're not alone.
The Page Act, it has two pretty blameless ideas in it: to stop human trafficking of women for prostitution, and then to stop the importation of laborers against their will.
Hard to argue with, but history shows the Page Act of 1875 was the product of decades of anti-Chinese hate. Chinese workers who came for the gold rush and the railroad were followed by more who were pivotal at jobs in mining and agriculture that white Americans refused. Chinese workers were cheaper than white workers, many of whom were already competing with newly freed black workers. Lynchings of Chinese men and boys like the 1871 Los Angeles Massacre, anti-Chinese editorials and cartoons, even poems set to music, teed up Republican Congressman Horace Francis Page of California to write the bill that would become the Page Act. And Page was encouraged by President Ulysses Grant himself, who told Congress in his annual address in 1874 that Chinese women were, quote, brought for shameful purposes, and that Chinese men were forced to work, quote, under contracts with headmen who owned them almost absolutely. Neither statement was completely true. Chinese men were often kidnapped from South China and enslaved to work in Peru and Cuba on plantations and in the guano digs.
But the Chinese who came to the United States, the men, they came as free workers. The women, yes, there was sex trafficking, but there was a lot of ideas about Chinese women are inherently immoral.
When the 43rd Congress passed the Page Act on March 3, 1875, it banned anyone from China, Japan, or any Oriental country who was a felon, an unindentured laborer, or an unaccompanied woman, quote, imported for the purposes of prostitution.
One of the big reasons that men don't bring in wives they actually have married is because immigration officials routinely harass them. They treat all Asian women as if they're potential prostitutes. These are really, really deep and pervasive ideas even now, and they feed into, the host of stereotypes that we all still live with, but that fall heavily on API women. The idea is the Chinese can't be free. They're inherently servile. They're not on par with the white race.
Incidentally, prostitution remained legal throughout 19th century America. These images show government-sanctioned housing for prostitutes and their clients built beside railroad tracks in LA. So the Page Act did not stop human trafficking. It did stop Chinese women from legally entering the U.S. This kept Chinese families oceans apart. It also prevented new ones from taking root in America. The result? Chinese enclaves made up almost entirely of men.
They can't bring women in large numbers. They can't form families, but then their communities are talked about as suspect. They're blamed for the conditions that the law perpetuates. And, those again also feed into stereotypes about, Asian men being somehow feminized. Well, they're working in domestic service, they're working in restaurants, they're working in hand laundries. Those are women's work.
The Page Act becomes the foundation for the even more restrictive Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. Anyone who was Chinese, except for the occasional student or merchant, was barred from entering the country. The penalty for breaking this law was $500, or $14,000 today, or a year in prison. Any Chinese person already in the U.S. was barred from naturalizing. This law was renewed repeatedly over the next 70 years. In the post-Reconstruction era, with white supremacist violence increasing and an economic depression setting in, the Chinese in America became legal scapegoats. The consequences were profound for AAPI communities and their civic power over the next century.
Access to services has often come through political mobilization, political activism, demands. And you have a population that was denied access to what other immigrant groups did to defend themselves, which is to naturalize. You vote, you force representation, and Chinese Americans didn't have the ability to do that because they were the citizen population was so small.
This is a period of time in which the country was asking itself, who is an American and who is not?
CUNY professor and author Dr. Vincent Chin explored her own family's hardships living through decades of the Chinese Exclusion Act in her book, Mott Street, a Chinese American family's story of exclusion and homecoming. Her research confirms American nativism as a blunt force instrument of power-hungry politicians, as she describes in this book talk at Queens College in 2024.
Different iterations of Chinese exclusion kept cropping up during what periods of time? Election years and midterm elections. The idea of keeping an immigrant group out is so powerful in terms of galvanizing votes. And it continues to today.
CUNY Graduate School of Public Health and Health Policy professor Dr. Emma Sui says an understanding of prejudice, policy, and how both have shaped societies can help to fight a major source of poor population health: racism.
One of the sources that we point to in public health that has been very helpful to us as a field in understanding this is Arlene Geronimus's work around weathering and the effect that persistent exposure to racism, all different kinds of racism, but interpersonal racism being one of them, can have on the body over time.
Sui co-wrote a 2021 editorial with Mary Hunn of New York City's Department of Mental Health and Hygiene, calling for more history lessons at schools of public health. It appeared in the American Journal of Public Health shortly after the CDC declared racism a public health crisis. Black Lives Matter was already a movement, and anti-Asian hate crimes were surging that year. Sui sees a connection between health outcomes and systemic racism in government policies like the Page and Exclusion Acts.
It felt like the Page Act unlocked something for us in understanding our own experiences and the experiences of Asian women we knew. I saw Lloyd Suh's play called The Far Country, which is about a family in the wake of the Chinese Exclusion Act. The fact that that Chinese Exclusion Act has a place in my own history, I think helps me to feel more connected to groups that are being affected today by similar exclusionary policies. And I think that telling these stories from history and really understanding them and feeling them is one important way of building that kind of empathy.
Experts have said immigration is almost always a labor story. It's also a story about civic health. For Asian American Life, I'm Vivian Lee.
The 20th century was marked by wartime hysteria, which resulted in racist anti-Asian policies. Our Kyung Yoon shares an important lesson.
In the wake of Japan's surprise attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, the United States declared war on Japan and entered World War II. For Americans of Japanese descent, it was a time marked by racial scapegoating, culminating with President Franklin D. Roosevelt issuing Executive Order 9066, which led to the forced removal of around 120,000 Japanese Americans from their homes and their incarceration in internment camps. Despite the injustice, many second-generation Japanese Americans, or Nisei, were determined to serve their country. To enlist, they had to pass a loyalty test. After proving their dedication, they formed the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, officially activated on February 1, 1943. What followed was truly remarkable. The 442 Regiment became one of the most decorated units in U.S. history, known for their bravery and success. Among their victories was a crucial battle in France, where they came to the aid of the Texas 141st Infantry, saving the lives of 270 U.S. soldiers and liberating 2 French towns from the Nazis. Since the 2024 election, changes in political leadership have affected how organizations and historical narratives, including DEI initiatives, are handled.
We've ended the tyranny of so-called diversity, equity, and inclusion policies all across the entire federal government and indeed the private sector and our military.
As a result, Asian American history, including the legacy of the 442nd Infantry, is being erased. On March 5th, the story of the 442nd Infantry was removed from the U.S. Army website. The 442nd Infantry reminds us of a painful contradiction. While their families were being displaced and imprisoned, the men of the 442nd still chose to fight for the very country that had questioned their loyalty. Many continued to serve their communities long after the war, including Senator Daniel Inouye of Hawaii, who lost an arm in battle and later received the Medal of Honor from President Bill Clinton in 2000. He served in the Senate until his passing in 2012, leaving behind a powerful legacy of courage and public service. In 1988, President Reagan offered a long overdue apology for the internment of Japanese Americans. But 6 years earlier, the tragic death of Vincent Chin was a reminder that anti-Asian bias hadn't disappeared. It was still quietly shaping lives and taking them. On June 19, 1982, in Detroit, 27-year-old Vincent Chin was with his friends celebrating his bachelor party at the Fancy Pants Club when he got into a fight with two white auto workers. It was a time when Japan's dominance over the auto industry had sparked a powder keg of anti-Asian animosity in the Motor City of Detroit. Ronald Evans and Michael Nitz hurled racial slurs at Chin, who was Chinese American, as they beat him to death with a baseball bat, blaming him for job losses in their industry. Chin's murder and the aftermath as Asian Americans mobilized to demand justice are explored in the Oscar-nominated documentary Who Killed Vincent Chin by Christine Choi and Renee Tajima Pena.
Everybody asks me why I pick a film subject, and it's because something really pisses me off, and this just hit me in the gut.
Renee Tajima Pena is a renowned documentary filmmaker and a professor of Asian American Studies at UCLA. She was just a few years out of college in 1983, but already an activist when she learned about the brutal killing that had taken place a year earlier in Detroit.
I got this mailing with a clipping inside from Detroit about this murder. A young man, Chinese American named Vincent Chin, had been beaten to death with a baseball bat by Ron Evans and Michael Nitz. They were two Chrysler workers. By March of 1983, Ron Evans and Mike Nitz had pleaded guilty to manslaughter, and they were sentenced to no jail time and a fine. I think it was a $3,000 fine and some change, and 3 years probation.
Justice for Vincent Chin! Justice for Vincent Chin!
The failure of the criminal justice system to punish the killers sparked protests, first in Detroit, led by Helen Zia, and then expanded across the country, uniting Asian Americans and their allies in a national movement for justice.
There is something to getting together and building this collective power as Asian Americans, whether we're Korean or Chinese or Japanese or Filipino or South Asian or Southeast Asian. There's a reason we have to come together.
Tajima Pena says that the surge of anti-Asian violence that's grown out of the pandemic has been met by a new response and resistance.
So you see people who were involved in the Vincent Chin movement who are a little older, more established, more experienced, but then you see this wider kind of, new generations and this larger group of pan-Asian Americans who are being activated to campaign for justice, to defend our communities.
In today's political climate, fueling fear, uncertainty, and attacks on immigrant communities, the legacy of Vincent Chin is a reminder that silence is not an option. For Asian American communities, it's a moment to come together, to build voice, to build power, and to stand united. I'm Kyung Yoon for Asian American Life.
In the 21st century, xenophobia and anti-Asian hate surged to an all-time high. Here's Susan Jun with more.
The terror attacks of 9/11 led to a significant increase in anti-Muslim sentiment. However, as professor of law at the CUNY School of Law, Shamtoli Huq details, structural Islamophobia has long been present in the United States.
Islamophobia has always existed. The presence of Muslims in the United States dates back to early Americas, and Muslims have a continuous documented presence in the Americas. This is not just immigrants. 1/3 of Muslim Americans are Black Muslims, many who trace their ancestry to formerly enslaved persons. Some of the early Muslims were enslaved Muslims, and because Afro-origin Muslims in the time antebellum South tended to be more literate because it was required for them to read the Quran, the holy book, they thought that Muslims would start rebellions, would speak against the enslavement. Within Islam, there's a clear mandate to stand up for oppression. And so many Muslims who were enslaved were very direct participants of like abolitionist movements. And that history really needs to be uncovered. I just wanted to remind people that Muslims didn't just arrive in 9/11. After 9/11, we have seen a dramatic spike in Islamophobia and hate crimes. So pre-9/11, the FBI recorded 28 anti-Muslim hate crime incidents, and post-9/11, the number spiked to 481, 1,600% increase. The perception is that being Muslim and being American nationality, even though one's a religion and one's a nationality, are actually in odds. And I think that reflects the bias. Immediately after 9/11, I was counsel to the New York Taxi Workers Alliance. It's a majority drivers, many South Asian, many Muslims. Many of the members and my clients were approached at their home by FBI. Just an allegation that, oh, you're a terrorist. That was enough. You didn't have to show any evidence. And because Muslims are thought to be un-American, that a lot of non-Muslims justify this kind of expansive reach of the government, weakening of warrants. So it was widespread, pervasive discrimination that impacted Muslim Americans on all aspects of life. So most definitely in terms of hate crimes, but the other areas we don't think about is jobs, housing, landlords not wanting to rent to Muslim tenants. We have to look at it not only at the individual level and changing perceptions, but that's not enough. We have to think about how the law is being implemented. So post 9/11, we saw the Patriot Act with expanded surveillance of Americans generally, but it was disproportionately utilized towards Muslim Americans. The second is called the National Security Entry and Exit Registration System, where non-citizens, even green card holders, who had to register with ICE, and they were predominantly individuals from Muslim countries. This has been referred to in 2016 as the Muslim registration. And I think a lot of folks don't realize that registration system existed prior to the first Trump presidency. And a lot of what we're seeing in the current moment also reflects this ongoing, continuous, pervasive Islamophobia. One of the beginnings is to understand this community and to know who they are. And one of the things is the U.S. Muslim community is one of the most racially, ethnically, and theologically diverse community. And it's one of the fastest growing communities in the United States, even within Islam, just as Christianity has different threads. In Islam, there's Sunni, there's Shia, there's Sufis, there are multiple robust theological debates and pluralism. The other thing that I think gets really less discussed is the Muslim community are experiencing high rates of economic insecurity. They experience high rates of discrimination in the workplace and employment. They're 3 times more likely to be without a job looking for work because of this discrimination. 40% of Muslims report incomes under $30,000. So this is a workforce that experiences poverty, economic insecurity. And so when you take that through an intersectional lens, poverty, economic insecurity, political marginalization, and then law enforcement surveillance, this is a community that is experiencing marginalization on multiple fronts. So it's a really deep-rooted biases that gets built into the law. And so our work is really to change perception on an individual level. There's been, inviting people, and we just had Ramadan, inviting people to experience Ramadan with each other, with neighbors. And this has had some impact, but we also have to challenge some of these laws, that it's not being used against certain people in a discriminatory manner.
From Islamophobia in the wake of 9/11 to anti-Asian sentiment during the pandemic, the scapegoating of Asians has become a disturbing trend in America.
Chinese virus.
Kung flu.
Racist rhetoric during the pandemic blaming the COVID-19 virus on China fueled anti-Asian sentiment and hate attacks against Asian Americans, which rose nearly 150% in 2020, while decreasing for the general population. Advocacy group Stop AAPI Hate received almost 4,000 hate incident reports that year alone.
Asian piece of
Oh my God! Get out of here!
From racist remarks to vicious attacks and murders, alarming acts of hate against Asian Americans surged, causing fear and outrage among the AAPI community.
How can humans treat other humans like this?
We are living in a very scary time where people are looking to scapegoat people who look like me.
I don't want them under me. Tell them to move.
In March of 2020, reports started circulating of incidents where Asian Americans were sprayed with disinfectant, spit on, pushed, punched, and stabbed. Then in April of that year, a 39-year-old Asian woman in Brooklyn suffered chemical burns after a man doused her with a substance on the street. The summer of 2020 brought more attacks, including one on a pregnant Asian mother who was punched in the face after her female assailant sprayed her and her daughter with water and hurled racist remarks at them. Then in July, an 89-year-old Asian woman in Brooklyn was set on fire by two boys. The shocking case made headlines and helped to raise awareness of the growing anti-Asian sentiment.
She didn't do nothing. Why are you pushing the poor woman?
I don't know why anyone would ever do that. I feel so bad for her. I hope she's okay.
In August, responding to increasing attacks, the NYPD formed an Asian hate crimes task force comprised of 25 Asian American detectives. Sadly, that didn't deter the violence, which turned deadly the following winter in San Francisco, as an attack on an 84-year-old Thai American by a teenager later resulted in the elderly man's tragic death, leaving behind a heartbroken family.
He never wake up again. I never see him again.
Then in February, this shocking video captured a 91-year-old Asian man being thrown to the ground in Oakland's Chinatown. The attacker had also pushed down an elderly Asian man and middle-aged Asian woman earlier in the day. March saw a grave turn in anti-Asian sentiment, first with a series of mass shootings by a 21-year-old man at 3 Atlanta spas that left 8 people dead, 6 of them Asian women.
I feel like I'm just pressing down a lot of my emotions, and I know it's going to come out one way or another.
In late March, a 65-year-old Filipino woman was attacked on her way to church outside a luxury building in New York City. A man kicked the woman in the stomach, knocked her to the ground, and repeatedly stomped on her face, while surveillance video showed 2 building workers watching and doing nothing to help. After the attack, one of the workers shut the door as the victim lay on the ground. As the attacks continued, those in the Asian community fought back, like this Asian grandma in San Francisco who was punched in the face and fought off her 39-year-old attacker, hitting him with a stick. Nearly $1 million was raised to pay her medical bills, which she then donated to fight racism. These senseless and horrific attacks sparked protests across the country and galvanized lawmakers to take action, which led then-President Biden to pass the COVID-19 hate crime bill. Unfortunately, those measures haven't been enough to stop the rise of anti-Asian hate crimes, which continue to surge since Trump's re-election. For Asian American Life, I'm Susan Jun.
And finally, we end with history in the making. The Trump administration is making good on a campaign promise to deport millions of immigrants. While the target has been undocumented immigrants, this time green card holders, international students, and more are finding that America is no longer a place where they are welcome.
On day one, I will launch the largest deportation program in American history.
Within days of his second term in the White House, the mass deportations began. The U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement, ICE, has conducted raids in major and small cities. While the Trump administration has said they will crack down on violent criminals, many are being detained and arrested for past crimes, including nonviolent crimes they have already served time for.
A longtime University of Washington lab tech and green card holder remains in ICE custody in Tacoma. She was detained when she came home from the Philippines last month on murky legal grounds.
According to ICE, Llewellyn Dixon, a legal green card holder, is a convict. She has an embezzlement conviction, pleading guilty to the nonviolent offense back in 2020 after being accused of stealing $6,000. But that past conviction still led to her arrest. Her court date is set for June. There is also Ma Yang, a Wisconsin woman who came to America as a refugee when she was 8 months old. She was deported to Laos, a country she has never been to, because of a past marijuana trafficking conviction she had already served time for.
So what we're seeing collectively is just this onslaught of heightened immigration enforcement that we've never witnessed in the past.
Rose Cuisan Villazor is a law professor and director of the Rutgers School of Law Center for Immigrant Justice. On the day of our interview, she was prepping for a symposium on immigration and citizenship laws.
This must be keeping a lot of people in the shadows.
Yeah, I mean, there are many reports of children staying home because their parents don't want to bring them to school because they're afraid that their children or they themselves might get detained if they leave their house, right? So it's that people are avoiding hospitals even if they have to go seek medical care.
There are an estimated 1.7 million undocumented Asians in the U.S. Some cross the border illegally. Others overstayed tourist and student visas. Meanwhile, many in the Southeast Asian communities, the Vietnamese, Cambodians, Hmongs, and Laotians, came as refugees after wars involving the U.S. ravaged their countries. Some, like Yang, were born in refugee camps in Thailand.
There are immigrants here. Some overstayed their visa. Some entered here under false pretenses. I'm not denying that. But when they're here, what we're seeing is that just this desire to have a better life. And so many are working, they're going to school, they're contributing to their churches, to their communities.
But public sentiment appears to be leaning for deportations. According to Pew Research, 59% of Americans say they approve of Trump's actions, with 35% strongly approving. And while most Democrats disapprove, 43% of Asian Democrats are in support of deporting the undocumented. The White House is also going after international students. Homeland Security has revoked the visas of hundreds of international students, many from India and China, often without any warning or recourse for appeals, some for minor traffic violations.
Columbia University student believes that she's been targeted for deportation, so she is proactively suing the Trump administration.
Even legal green card holders are not immune from arrests. Columbia student Yeonso Chung, who participated in last spring's pro-Palestinian protests at Columbia University, is fighting her arrest and deportation in court. Chung is a legal green card holder and has been in the U.S. since she was 7. As of press time, the deportations aren't letting up. Professor Quizon Villazor urges all immigrants, whether you are undocumented or have a green card, to stay informed about your rights. And despite all the news, she remains hopeful.
I'm thinking of Yeonsong Chung and how she is doing something about her rights. She's resisting the unlawful action by ICE officers. That's consistent with some of the bravery and courage that our ancestors did in the United States in fighting for citizenship, in fighting for the right to stay in the United States. And so there is this through line that I am seeing in terms of resilience and resistance that is giving me hope.
We close this chapter in history with a reminder that the knowledge of our past can help shape our future. If you want to learn more about these stories, be sure to visit us on YouTube, Facebook, and Instagram. Plus, you could watch us on the go by downloading our CUNY TV app on your phone. I'm Ernabel DeMillo. Thanks so much for watching this special edition of Asian American Life, Roots and Routes, Our Immigration Story.